Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. We are in the second week of discussing John Locke, right? And this is week 6 of the course. So that means the midterm is in 3 weeks, or you're supposed to submit your answers to the midterm questions in 3 weeks. We could put it that way. And that also means that I should give you the midterm questions in 2 weeks, right? So that is coming right up, which feels odd. It's still September. It seems early. But the midterm seems to be coming up soon at the same time. Okay, so I gave you a lot of reading on Locke. I do not deny it, right? So I want to focus on the will this week. That's a large part of what we read about, right? So I gave you like 40 pages of reading. I suppose I have some mild regret. But you probably haven't finished reading it either, to be honest. So let's focus on the will, right? And that discussion wraps up around page 342. So I would advise you to read the rest of it, but I'm focusing on the text that we see up to that point, and not really paying attention to much after that, even though Locke's discussion of personal identity is considered important. Scholars still talk about it a lot, and that does come after the discussion of the will. But we can only do so much. It's a lot of reading, and I want to focus, and I think the will is pretty interesting, so that's what I'm going to focus on. Okay, so moving on from there. So looking at chapter 12, we are of course still in book 2, as you will probably recall. Looking at chapter 12 of book 2, Locke starts discussing complex ideas. This will help set us up for the will. So there are some preliminaries here before we get to the will. He says that complex ideas fall under 3 broad categories. Number 1, modes. Number 2, substances. Number 3, relations. Part of what's interesting here is modes and substances were things that Descartes had plenty to say about, but he was coming at it from a metaphysical point of view, right? He was talking about things that really exist regardless of our perception of them. Locke is focused on ideas. He's saying that these are 3 broad categories of complex ideas, right? Which, I should say, gets us closer to Kant's view in a way. Kant is a transcendental idealist, and he considers substance to be a basic category of the understanding, so that when the understanding goes to work organizing experience, it organizes experience in terms of that basic category of substance, right? So Locke has moved us away from substance as a metaphysical category toward a category of idea, and that influences Kant down the road. So I did make that decision that we weren't going to cover Kant, but on the other hand, as I've mentioned, Kant's work is a sort of culmination of the early modern period, right? He's a key figure in the Enlightenment. So yeah, I will reference Kant from time to time, and I like to point out when we're moving toward some view of Kant's. I think that's important. Okay, so we got these three broad categories. Looking at modes and substances, the main way to distinguish them is substances have an independent sort of existence. As Locke puts it, they subsist independently by themselves. Modes do not. The very word mode might put you in mind of modification, and it should. A mode is a modification of a substance. Modes don't subsist on their own, but as part of substances, right? So, sphericality, to pick up a primary quality, subsists in a substance, maybe a rubber ball, right? So we are talking about ideas here. So your idea of a rubber ball, I guess, if you like, that's a substance. And then sphericality is one of its modes. And then relations are comparisons between ideas, right? They involve more than one idea, bigger than, more spherical than. Those are relations. But important to our discussion of the will, Locke considers power a relation, which again shows that he's coming at this from the point of view of someone really interested in conscious experience, right? He's not really thinking of power metaphysically. He's thinking of our experience of power, and our experience of power is, well, there have to be two things involved, right? And there's an alteration in one, and we attribute it to the other, right? So basically, our experience of power has to involve change. And what we do is we systematize our experience of change. And we say, well, this kind of change in my ideas tends to occur when I have this other kind of idea, right? An example he gives is wax being blanched, or in other words, whitened by the sun, right? So we systematize our experience by saying, oh, when the sun is up, then wax is blanched or whitened, right? And so we think there's a power in the sun. We're led to believe there's a power in the sun that whitens the wax, right? And then conversely, there is a power, Locke calls it a power, in the wax to be whitened. I would call it a potential or capacity or something. But I guess capacity's close to power. He says power. Maybe that's odd, given the way we use words, but fine. There's a power in the wax to be whitened, right? And so you put the sun and the wax together, and the whitening happens in the wax, and both of the powers are activated at the same time. Okay, so obviously we'll come back to powers since the will is a power. Let's say something about chapter 20, which is also important to the discussion of the will. Chapter 20 is about modes of pleasure and pain, and now we know what a mode is. It's a modification. Pleasure and pain don't exist on their own. They exist in minds. And Locke does make this point that, we distinguish pains of the body and pains of the mind, but then, in a sense, they're all pains of the mind, or pleasures of the mind. I guess I was focused on pain. So is Locke to some extent. But yeah, pleasure and pain are subjective. That's the normal view. That's Locke's view. We do experience some of them in the body, but without the mind, there can't be any pleasure or pain in the body, right? So sadness is a mental pain. We say having a cramped thigh is a bodily pain. We say, I seem to have a cramped thigh today. But they're both mental in a sense, right? I mean, they both have a subjective existence that depends on the mind. Okay, and then getting us even closer to our discussion of the will, but we're not quite there yet. Locke says explicitly on page 325, and I'm quoting him now, "Things then are good or evil only in reference to pleasure or pain." Okay, so he's a consequentialist. Maybe you've studied consequentialism in another course, right? In other words, you could have the view that some actions are intrinsically right and some are intrinsically wrong, and that would be Kant's view, by the way. Or you could have the view that actions are wrong or right depending on the consequences they produce. And usually when you have that view, you also have the view that the consequences that matter are pleasure and pain. So consequentialism is broader than what we call utilitarianism, but they do tend to go together. So consequentialism is the view that actions are right or wrong depending on consequences. Utilitarianism is that view plus the view that the consequences that matter are pleasure and pain. So Locke is a utilitarian, even though he's not using that word, right? And John Stuart Mill comes later. The views aren't exactly the same, but we're certainly seeing some utilitarianism here, right? Or we could use the word hedonism, which John Stuart Mill also tosses around. Hedonism is a theory of value, which basically says pleasure is the only thing that's good, really. Pain is the only thing that's bad, really. And that's why those are the consequences that matter, because pleasure and pain are the only things that are really good or bad. And so that seems to be Locke's view, but it's not as refined as John Stuart Mill's or Jeremy Bentham's. Both of those figures come later. Okay, so chapter 21. That's specifically about power. So I've already mentioned our notion of power depends on our perception of change, right? We see that ideas come to be, we see that ideas cease to exist, and we seek out patterns, and we wonder what to attribute that to, right? And we see stability and change at the same time. And so we think those things that remain stable while other things change have the power to change them, right? So I already gave you one example, but then I'm an example and you're an example, right? As Locke says, our idea of setting something into motion comes from within, right? That's where we're really able to experience motion being initiated, right? I have an intention to do this, to wiggle my finger. Is this a wiggle? What's a wiggle? I think this counts. So I have an intention to wiggle my finger, and then I have a sensory experience of my finger wiggling and in a way being wiggled if I sort of detach my own inner experience from my visual experience of the finger. So I experience the intention that it wiggle, and then I'm having a visual experience of it being wiggled, and so I'm having, fully looking at the complex picture here, looking at the whole, I'm having an experience of my finger being moved by my intention to move it, right? So what's stable is my mind and my intentions to do things, which I have all day long. And what's changing in this instance is the movement of my finger. And then, as the day goes on, I have other intentions, right? And then other things are altered as a result of my having different intentions, right? And that's how our conception of power operates in general. As I was saying, we experience change, but we experience some things remaining stable while other things change. We look for patterns. We look for something staying the same while some other fixed thing is altered, right? Maybe in the same way over and over again. That's what gives us really good evidence that the stable thing is changing the thing that's being altered. I mean, this is how scientific experimentation works, actually, right? How many different variables can we keep the same, and then while we're changing this little variable over here, and then seeing what results, right? And that's how we come to attribute causation these days, right? We're using the word power here, but obviously there's a lot of overlap between causation and this discussion of power. Okay, so looking at page 328 now specifically, we get a definition of the will. So let me read that, actually. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. Okay, page 328. Here we are, section 5. The power which the mind has thus to order the consideration of any idea, or the forbearing to consider it, or to prefer the motion of any part of the body to its rest, and vice versa, in any particular instance, is that which we call the will. The actual action, or its forbearance, is that which we call volition or willing. Okay, so the word prefer there is problematic. You have to read it in context. I think that word could throw you. Basically, looking at the discussion as a whole, Locke is saying that the will is a power the mind has to initiate physical or mental action. He uses the word prefer here, but then he also says when the mind actually puts something into motion, mentally or physically, that's when volition is occurring, right? So I would prefer to think about or talk about having an intention. I find that a little more clear and precise, but that's not the word Locke is using, so we need to talk about his theory of the will. And that theory is it's a power of your mind to set something into motion, a physical action or a mental action, right? And that's basically what it is. So whenever your mind is setting something into motion, mentally or physically, you are exercising your will, right? And then that tells us what voluntary and involuntary mean. Again, taking things on the whole, by the way, I don't want to get into this too much, but Locke did rewrite his essay a few times, and his initial view was that the will was some kind of desire. Now, get that out of your mind. Maybe I shouldn't even have said it. That's definitely not the view in this version of the essay that we're reading. So in later drafts, he corrected himself. He said, no, that's not right. So I think that's why the word prefer is in there, because he initially had this view that the will was some kind of desire, but he very explicitly says, no, that's not correct here. And we'll get into why. We'll get there. But I just wanted to explain why the word prefer is there. It's an odd word, given what he actually thinks the will is in this version of the book that we're reading. And so I think it's just a leftover from when his view of the will was different. So anyway, if an action is voluntary, that means it's happening because of the exercise of your will. That's it, right? If an action is involuntary, then it's happening without that, without the exercise of your will, right? So you wouldn't normally think of the pumping of your heart as an action, but that is an example that Locke uses. So if we call that an action at all, it's an involuntary action, right? Not because you don't want it to happen or something like that. That's not it. The point is you're not exercising your will to make it happen. So I think that helps to clarify what's involuntary. It's something you do, but you didn't will it. And my blinking is involuntary. If I did have a spasm, right, and my legs started twitching, that would be involuntary, and it might happen since I'm cramping, right? I know you wanted to know all about that, so there you go. Okay. Now, in section 8, still on page 328, liberty or freedom is defined. I take it that liberty and freedom are synonyms. Locke usually says liberty, but sometimes he uses the word free in connection with liberty. So let's say that liberty and freedom are the same thing here, right? And what are they? What is liberty? When we have the power to do as we will, then we're at liberty. When we cannot do as we will, then we are under necessity. Right? Okay, so what does that mean? So I will to pick up the pen. That worked. I was at liberty to pick it up. I might go to pick it up and find that it's too heavy. That would be odd and surprising, but it's possible, right? But we could also imagine I go to pick up a box. I don't know what's in the box. I think I can pick it up, right? And then my body won't let me. So I'm not at liberty to do it. Right, so I have the power to pick up the box, or I don't. So liberty, Locke never says this, but liberty isn't a single power, right? Because there are different contexts in which liberty means completely different things, right? If the box is too heavy, I'm not at liberty to pick it up. But that has to do with my physical constitution, right? I'm not strong enough, or my back can't handle it today, or something like that. I could be in jail, and I want to leave my jail cell, but I'm not at liberty. That's a whole different issue that has nothing to do with how much I can lift, right? So the will is a single power, and it has a certain definition, and it's well defined, well delineated. Again, I don't see where Locke says this, but liberty is not a single power, right? Because it's the power to do what we will, and we will to do so many different things that liberty will not mean the same thing across different contexts. Hope that makes sense. I wanted to say that for a couple of reasons, partly to explain that, yeah, we really do need to distinguish the will and freedom. They're different things. The will is a specific power of the mind, and then liberty is the sort of leeway you have, depending on what's going on and where you are and what you're trying to do, the leeway you have to actually execute what you will. And again, that means different things at different times. So we need to distinguish these, but they interact in important ways, right? Speaking of which, it might be important to point out that an action could be voluntary but done under necessity, right? So what you do voluntarily isn't the same as what you're at liberty to do, right? So for instance, and again, this is also Locke's example, there could be an earthquake. I don't think that's exactly what he said, but there could be an earthquake that opens up a gap in the wall of my gel cell. Now I can escape, and then I think, I like it in here. It's quiet. I can read a lot. And they'll just go arrest me again if I leave, right? So I voluntarily stay in the gel cell, and in this scenario, I'm at liberty, but then they patch up the wall, and now I'm under necessity to stay. But I got to make that decision about it, right? It seemed like there was an opening, literally an opening. There was an opportunity to leave, and I didn't. So now I'm voluntarily there, but under necessity, right? So that's an interesting kind of case. Okay, so now we get to something really meaty here, I think. Is the will free? This is a question that people ask all the time. Is the will free? And then Locke says, this is pages 329 going into 330, he says it's insignificant to ask whether the human will is free. That's an interesting view. It's not a meaningful question. So if you ask Locke, do we have free will? His answer is that's not a meaningful question, right? So that's interesting. A lot of philosophers have had that view. A lot of them are very concerned about the question of whether the will is free. You do see this a lot in questions about free will and the meaning of life. That's another area where I see the same thing. A lot of philosophers are concerned about whether life has a meaning, whether life is meaningful, and a lot of other philosophers think, well, that's a dumb question. Don't ask whether life has meaning. That's a silly question. So that's a sort of reductive view, right? That I'm not going to take that question seriously. Forget about it, right? And so that is Locke's view here. That it's a silly question. So that's reductive, right? He in other words, he's reducing the force of the question He's reducing a philosophical problem to a misunderstanding in a way. So he does think there are interesting issues surrounding freedom of the will, but if you ask that specific question, is the will free? He says, well, that's silly. Now, why is it silly? Well, mainly because of the view that we were bringing out, that the will is one power, and then liberty is another power. So if you ask, is the will free, you're saying, does this power have this other power? And that's confused, because powers don't have powers, substances have powers, right? More generally, relations don't exist on their own. Remember, power is a relation. So there were three broad categories of complex ideas: modes, substances, and relations. A power is a kind of relation. Relations exist in comparison. So you have to have at least two substances to have a relation. So you can't have powers out there on their own. You can't have relations out there on their own. Substances are related, and substances have powers, or not, right? So the will isn't free. The will isn't not free. It's not a meaningful issue. Okay. So being free, this is a little redundant, but just to really drive home the point here, page 331, Locke says, being free just is being able to do what one wills. That's paraphrase, that's not quotation. But yeah, being free just is being able to do what you will, right? And you can't be any more free than that. If you exercise your will, and then you're able to do what you will, you're not impeded, you're not prevented. There's an act of the will, and then you actually do what you will. That's freedom. You're free, right? So I already said Locke does think there are interesting issues surrounding freedom of the will. So one question he's willing to take as significant, that has something to do with freedom of the will, is this. Page 331 still, he says, is a person free to will? Could you be free to will or not will? Sounds odd, but he does think that's a meaningful question. And then primarily he wants to say, no, you're not free to will or not will. In other words, if somebody proposes an action to you, or you propose an action to yourself, should I go for a walk, say, well, I'm not free not to will in that case. In other words, either I will go ahead and take a walk, because now I have an intention to go for a walk, or I will forbear. He likes to use that word. I will forbear to go for a walk. In other words, I just won't. But that's an act of the will, because it did get proposed to me. I thought about going for a walk, so I had this idea of an action I could do, and I negated it, right? So I exercised my will. Okay, so that's forbearance for you. There was a proposition, and I said no. And then there's another question that's related to that. Page 332, he asks this question: is a person at liberty to will which of the two he or she pleases, motion or rest? Are you free to will what you will, is sort of how we could put that generally. Locke doesn't think that's meaningless. He says the question is absurd, and then that leads some commentators to think he's saying, no, you're not free to will what you will. But I think, and other commentators think, there's a disagreement here among scholars. If you keep reading, he clearly thinks the question is absurd because the answer is so obviously yes. So he says it's absurd, but the question is answerable. So it's not meaningless then. So I'm not sure how he's using the word absurd. I think he just means the answer is so obvious that there's no point in asking it. So it's not in the same category as the other question, whether the will is free. Right? Because that was supposed to be meaningless. That was sort of based on a category mistake. This question at least is answerable, and the answer is yes. You are free to will what you will. Right? And so an example he gives is there's a man standing on a cliff. He is at liberty to leap 20 yards downwards into the sea. Right? He has a power to leap or not to leap. So he's free. He's free to will what he wills. Right? And it doesn't matter that he can't really will the contrary, and he's certainly not at liberty to do the contrary. In other words, he can't leap upwards 20 yards. He can leap downwards 20 yards, right? So that he can will to leap downwards or forbear to will it means that he's free to will it. It doesn't matter that there are all these other alternative actions that he can do or he can't do. It's just, here's a specific action, leap downwards 20 yards. It's proposed to his mind somehow. If he's at liberty to do it, then he's at liberty. He's free. So he's free to will what he wills, right? So not meaningless, maybe a bit abstract, and again, sort of reductive, I think, right? Because you would think questions about free will are really deep, but he's saying this is trivially the case. It's not a deep. It's an answerable question, but it's not a deep one. Are you free to will what you will? Well, of course, because you can will it, or you could forbear, right? If you can will it, then you can forbear to will it, and then obviously you're free, right? So the will is free anytime it actually exercises its power, right? I guess a general way to put that is, if the will can exercise its power, then obviously it's possible to exercise its power, and so that's pretty much what freedom is for Locke, that you can do something, right? Sorry, that sounded trivial because it is. I mean, you end up sort of talking in circles because of the way Locke has set things up. So that's deliberate coming from him, right? He sort of set it up that way so that it becomes a sort of trivial question. You can do what you can do. I mean, it really does come down to that. But then there is this further question about what determines the will. That's a little deeper, right? So your will is free, say, or at least any particular exercise of the will is free. Apparently that's the view we've come to now. But what determines the will? What motivates the will or makes the will do what it does? Well, the mind determines the will. The will is a power of the mind, right? But then there's a further question about what moves the mind, Well, I think you know. Um, that brings us back to pleasure and pain. Pleasure and pain are the ultimate motivators, right? They move us this way or that. They suggest actions to us all the time, right? So the will is determined by the mind. The mind is determined by pleasure or pain, right? And then we'll come back to that. We'll say more about that. There's still freedom there, right? But let's come back to that. Locke focuses in on uneasiness, so that's interesting. When he thinks about what's really moving us consistently, you know, day by day, hour by hour, he says it's uneasiness. Now that's a kind of pain, right? Just to be clear, so that's not moving away from the view that pleasure and pain are what move us. It's just more specific. So uneasiness is basically pain. What kind of pain is it? It's a lack of satisfaction, right? So that's a lack of pleasure. So there's a sort of mundane pain, right? Which is just you're no longer finding pleasure in doing what you're doing. So that's a kind of boredom, maybe a frustration. He thinks that's actually the main motivator we have from day to day. I'm I'm sick of this. I'm done. I mean, that's uneasiness. That's what he means. There are different flavors and different degrees, but that's basically it. You start doing something, you will keep doing it so long as you're satisfied. But eventually, you'll feel uneasy. The activity will lack satisfaction, and you will move on to something else, right? Or again, there could be this other desire sort of off in the wings that's growing and growing. So I'm doing a lecture, but it's getting close to lunchtime, and so off in the wings there's this hunger that's growing, right? And so there's a very low level of uneasiness at first, right? At first I'm satisfied enough with what I'm doing, with giving my lecture, but then the hunger is growing. It's growing, right? So eventually I become uneasy enough that I stop. I hit the stop button and I walk away. I'm not going to do that right now, but that's the point, right? On the day to day, we basically get bored and tired and frustrated, and so we move on to something else that hasn't bored us yet. I mean, that is what he's saying, right? Seems to me. So sometimes there's a big uneasiness, but that he's just saying in general, how do we really live our lives? A lot, a lot of satisfied enough until now I'm uneasy, and now I'm going to move on to something else, and that's kind of how we conduct our lives, right? Good and evil, right, are determined by pleasure and pain, as I've already said. So we're supposed to pursue the good and avoid evil, but then that comes down to pleasure and pain. So there's an interesting explanation here of weakness of the will, right? Which is something philosophers really like to talk about. So do lawyers, in a way, in their own way. What is weakness of the will? How can your will be weak? What does that mean? There are different ways to spell that out. Well, Locke's view is, of course, you're motivated by pleasure, which is fine, by the way. I mean, it might sound bad, but then you have to remember that, well, the good is pleasure, right? Um, the problem is some goods or pleasures are remote, and some of them are uncertain. So I really like his example of the drunkard, or in other words, the alcoholic. I think this is a really helpful example, and it helps us understand his view really well. Um, the alcoholic knows that he will be healthier if he quits drinking. Sorry, I don't mean to be sexist. Locke keeps saying he all the time. Fine. This is a female drunk. Sorry. Dude, that's also a pejorative word. Alcoholic. So there's a woman who's an alcoholic. Yes, and she knows that she can save her liver by not drinking anymore. She knows that. She knows that her drinking is tearing her family apart, right? Everyone's freaked out and worried about her. She knows that she's missing work a lot because she's drinking too much, and they're going to fire her, and then she won't have any money, right? So she knows that she could preserve her health and preserve her finances by not drinking. She knows that. And of course, it's pleasant to be healthy, and it's pleasant to have the money you need to do the things you need to do. Those are good things, those are pleasant things. However, in the moment, there's this ongoing pain caused by not drinking because she's an alcoholic. So the pleasantness of being well and having money, those are a little remote and a little abstract and a little uncertain. She doesn't know exactly when she'll be fired, or if she's already been fired, she doesn't know exactly when she'll run out of money, right? And maybe she's trying to get another job, so she doesn't know if someone else will hire her. So there are all these uncertainties surrounding issues of health and finances. How much longer will I live if I'm destroying my liver? Well, I don't know. However, the pain of not drinking is constant. It's a constant drip, 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 drip. It's there. It's vivid, right? So that's a good point. So how is weakness of the will possible? Drip, 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 right? It comes down to uneasiness again. There's an ongoing uneasiness that doesn't let up. It's consistent. It doesn't stop, right? Whereas the pleasure that comes along with, having my finances in good order or having a job, remote and transient, and if I don't think about it, I won't experience the pleasure. So I might want to get myself in the right mindset where I'll think about those things, but maybe I won't be able to do it either, right? I mean, in AA, people talk about hitting rock bottom. That's an important moment. Why? Because of the pain. So now you've got a counter pain to help you deal with the drip, drip, drip. So there's the drip, drip, drip. But now, remember when I hit rock bottom, I can bring that pain to mind, and hopefully it's very vivid. Maybe you got arrested, somebody got arrested for a DUI, and they remember the humiliation of being arrested and the fine they had to pay, and they had to appear before the court, and maybe all of that is enough to counteract the drip, drip, drip. Okay, and then final thought for today. other things we could say, but the final thought for our purposes is we can not act on our desires, right? So remember, the will is not a desire, and that's a substantial point. If Locke said the will's not a desire, but the will is always set into motion by desire, which it sounds like he has said, it kind of sounds like that so far to a point, then, it wouldn't really be substantial or interesting that the will is not itself a desire. It would seem like a trivial point. But now we get this view that becomes very clear on page 336. That's not the only place it comes up, but if you want an anchor point, look at page 336. We can suspend our desires in a way. We can sort of put them into suspension. That is to say, we can have the presence of mind to say, okay, whatever my desire is, I'm not going to act on it. Even the alcoholic can go cold turkey. Will that lead to ultimate success? Well, I don't know. Maybe not. But right now, in the moment, cold turkey is a possibility. I can just say, no, I'm not going to act on that desire. And in general, I can just say, no, I'm not going to act on any of my desires. Right? I could just suspend them. Okay, I'm suspending. So what's the point? Well, the point is virtue is possible, salvation is possible, to get religious about it. You're not just buffeted around by desire all the time. You can step back and say, no. And that gives you room to think about what's truly good. Right? So you can be passive and let yourself be buffeted around by your different desires, but you can also put a stop to it and really step back and really reflect and say, well, what's really good and what's really bad? And once you have a vision of the good, which hopefully involves health and sound finances and an intact family, once you have a vision of it, you can cultivate a desire. You can do a vision board. I mean, I don't really recommend that, but you could, right? The point is, right, you can provoke desire in yourself. You can provoke passions in yourself. And yeah, you can use your imagination. You can envision certain outcomes and let the desire grow, right? And so the good may not motivate you, but then you can recognize that and you can step back and suspend the desires that are causing you trouble, and you can try to grow and cultivate the desires that you need to have, right? And so that's a Lockean conception of virtue, right? Seems to me this power of suspension would play a key role in a full-blown Lockean theory of virtue, which we're not getting here, but if we wanted a Lockean theory of virtue, this power to suspend would play a key role. Okay, so I think we understand Locke's conception of the will pretty well, and we'll leave it there. And this is the only lecture that we need for week 6. Thanks a lot.